I was born in a city that seemed to exist outside of time, Savannah, Georgia, with its winding streets, shady alleys under the crowns of century-old oaks covered with Spanish moss, and houses that stood like guardians of memory, with tall windows, porches, and porches, where in the evenings it smelled of jasmine and lemon mint. Here, every block breathed the past, old brick buildings, cast-iron lanterns, the subdued light of which did not dare to disturb the silence of the evenings. Amidst all this unhurried beauty, amidst the rustle of leaves and the murmur of fountains, my childhood flowed, strange, bright, and lonely. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. My name was June, and I was the youngest in the Matthews family, the daughter of a respectable doctor, Dr. Howard Matthews, and a college professor of American literature, Mrs. Caroline Matthews, a woman with a high forehead, a straight back, and a look that made even grown men justify themselves, even though they weren't accused of anything. My parents loved order and control. They believed in the power of discipline, clear plans for life, career ladders, and confidence in the future, which they believed could be forged in a childlike character in a cadet. They were cold, but not cruel. Their love was calculated, structured like a school bus schedule. And I was always late, in their opinion. My older brother Nicholas was someone they could be proud of without a shadow of a doubt. Tall, confident, with a slight smile, able to talk to anyone, he was the center of attention not only at school, but also later at university, where he became the star of the football team, and then returned home and quickly took his place in the city business. He sold houses, but in his hands even an empty cottage on a swamp seemed like a mansion with a history and a soul. His parents were proud of every achievement, every newspaper article, and every new contract. He was their triumph, their proof that parenting worked flawlessly. I was a shadow. Quiet, angular, clumsy. Too thin, too silent, with her head forever immersed in books, albums, paints, and her own fantasies. I didn't fit into the frame, and that's why I seemed unfinished to them, like a sketch that the artist abandoned without deciding to finish. My only refuge, the place where I felt needed, was the house of my grandfather, Arthur Matthews. He lived on the outskirts of the city, in a modest but cozy house with peeling paint on the shutters and an old maple tree by the porch, which every autumn strewed the yard with blood-red leaves. My grandfather was a man of a completely different world, a retired sailor. He knew a lot about loneliness, silence, and the depth of things. His face was weather-beaten, his hands always smelled of tobacco and paint, and his voice sounded hollow, like surf behind a wall of memory. His house always smelled of wood, salt, and something ancient and subtly beautiful. I could be myself there, I could be silent, I could talk for hours, and everything was fine. My grandfather was fond of painting. He didn't just collect paintings, he felt them. His collection consisted not of big names, but of paintings with stories behind them, forgotten names, destinies, tragedies, and hopes. He said that the real painting is not the signature at the bottom or the auction price, but what you feel when you look at it in silence. We sat by the fireplace for a long time, looking at seascapes darkened by time, or meadows where the wind seemed to be still stirring the grass. Sometimes he would take my hand and tell me that there was something in my fingers that real artists felt. Back then, I believed that I wasn't so wrong. On the day of my 20th birthday, my grandfather invited me to his place. It was early spring, and the city was just waking up from its winter slumber. The streets smelled of damp earth, and buds were timidly swelling on the trees. I came in the morning and stayed until sunset. We talked about American realist paintings, discussed light and composition, and argued about our favorite techniques. He was as alive as ever, his eyes were shining, his lips were trembling with laughter, his hands were moving all the time, as if conducting our conversation. In the evening, when the sky turned lavender and gold, he took me to his office. There, on the wall opposite the window, was a painting that I had seen dozens of times, but had never really looked at. It was a seascape, a rocky shore, dark waters, black seagulls above the foaming waves, the sky heavy from a thunderstorm. There was something inexplicably alive about her. My grandfather looked at it for a long time, then said that this painting was his treasure. It was painted by a little-known artist who died in poverty, but, as his grandfather said, his work began to arouse interest in New York art circles. He didn't keep it for profit, no. He just couldn't leave her. But now, he said, it was time to hand her over to me. He wanted me to be the keeper of this painting, as a part of his soul, as a letter to the future, which he saw in my eyes. He said he didn't know where I would be in 10 years, or with whom, or what I would become, but he hoped the painting would remind me of who I was in his eyes, strong, feeling alive. That evening, I walked home slowly, with a blurred face from tears that could not decide whether they were joyful or bitter. For the first time in a long time, I felt real. Not a shadow, not someone's mistake, but herself, June Matthews, Arthur's granddaughter, a girl with the fingers of an artist and a heart capable of feeling deeper than is allowed in our house. I didn't know yet how much things would change next. But that evening, with the rustle of oak trees and the creak of the wooden bridge, I felt that I had something of my own. And that was the beginning. Grandfather's death came on the day when spring was already giving way to the suffocating breath of summer. The air in the savannah became heavy, smelling of wet grass, dusty earth, and heat that seeped even through the old brick walls. Magnolias bloomed outside the window, and there seemed to be a strange premonition in the air. I stayed up half the night, tossing and turning in my room, catching shadows on the ceiling and listening to the crackle of wood, as if even the walls in this house could talk. The phone rang at 5 in the morning, hoarse and short, leaving no room for hope. A heart attack, they said. He died in his sleep. The world collapsed without too much noise. I don't remember how I got dressed, how I got to his house. Inside, everything was as before. There were dry brushes on the windowsill, a palette with dried paint in the corner, neatly folded newspapers, clippings from art magazines, and his notebook, in which I knew every squiggle. The air still smelled of tobacco and paint. Everything seemed alive, as if he had just gone out into the garden and was about to return, sit in his armchair by the window and say, as always, "Well, tell me." But instead, there is emptiness. A sticky, dragging void in which it was impossible to breathe. The funeral was dry. My parents were restrained, and there was concentration in their faces, not sorrow, as if the next point of the family plan needed to be closed at minimal cost. They spoke of their grandfather with respect, but as if they were talking about a man they had long lost touch with. Mom kept repeating that he'd left with dignity, as if dying from loneliness could be worthy. Dad pursed his lips and held my shoulder, as if he was afraid that I would melt if he let go. Nicholas nodded and said the right words, never once looking me in the eye. Everything seemed alien, even the people I grew up with. I tried to hold on. I told myself that this was what my grandfather would have wanted, for me to remain steadfast, not to let the pain consume me. I returned to this house every day, sorting things out, putting things in order, as if clearing the space inside of bitterness and anger. But with each passing week, it seemed that not only life, but also the memory of it was gradually disappearing from his house. The parents hired an appraiser, who silently walked through the rooms, noting names, dates, and prices in a notebook. Everything became numbers. Even the silence. Even my memories. All I asked for was that the painting, the one that grandfather called his treasure, remain in its place until all the formalities were completed. I was afraid that if she disappeared, a part of me would disappear. The parents, who weren't particularly interested in the details, nodded. Nicholas shrugged his shoulders indifferently. Then I believed them. I still wanted to believe. But a few weeks later, when I returned to the house, I felt cold. It wasn't from the weather, it came from the wall where the painting used to hang. She disappeared. She just disappeared. Without a trace, without explanation. I stood in front of an empty space, touching the warm imprint of the frame on the wallpaper with my fingers, and something inside me snapped. I knew it couldn't have been stolen. The house was closed, the alarm system was working. one of our own. I asked my parents. Mom looked at me with a slight annoyance, as if I was asking a stupid, untimely question again. Dad shrugged his shoulders. We didn't touch anything. Nicholas looked at me with polite incomprehension, as if he had never heard of the painting before. I tried to explain that it mattered. For me. For my grandfather. But in response, there is only silence and a calm, confident lie. Doubt was what settled in me that night. It was gnawing at me from the inside, like rust creeping up on iron. I remembered how recently Nicholas suddenly had new furniture in his house, a leather sofa, a wooden table, not in his spirit, too refined. As he talked about profitable investments, about new land outside the city, which he is going to build up. How he began to appear more and more often in fashionable establishments with his wife, sporting watches and cars that he could not afford before. All of this suddenly formed into a pattern in which only one element was missing: money. And I knew where they could come from. One evening, I was walking down the hallway at my parents' house when I heard voices. Dad and Nicholas spoke softly, almost in a whisper, but in the old house, the echo is adept at eavesdropping. I heard only fragments, the painting, the sum, no one knew anyway. I stopped, not breathing. The world stopped spinning for a second. They sold her. My painting. Bequeathed to me. Against my grandfather's will, behind his back, behind my back. For the sake of furniture. For the sake of the earth. For the sake of comfort. I didn't scream. She didn't go out into the hallway. I just stepped back and left the house into the warm, stuffy night, where the cicadas were singing as if nothing had happened. I walked down the street as if I were a stranger among the familiar lanterns, among the houses where everything breathed lies. The next day, I returned to my grandfather's house, my last stronghold of truth. I knew I had to find proof. I leafed through his notebooks, letters, and clippings, as if I were looking for answers from a ghost. And finally, in the drawer of the desk, under a stack of watercolors, I found an old, yellowed will. It was written in a lawyer's neat handwriting, with signatures and seals. And in it, in black and white, a painting in the living room, a seascape signed by an unknown author, is to be given to her granddaughter, June Matthews, as part of her inheritance. There can be no interpretation. There can be no accident. I sat down on the floor and held the paper in my trembling hands. Now I had the truth. But with it, the bitterness. Because what was anticipated became apparent. My family, those who were supposed to be my support, robbed me not only financially. They stole the trust. My memory was stolen. They crossed out my connection with my grandfather, as if it were insignificant, superfluous. But I knew that this struggle was just beginning. Because after a storm, as my grandfather used to say, the most important thing is not to fall when the sun comes out. When you hold proof of betrayal in your hands, the world doesn't fall apart with a bang, as is commonly thought. It cracks softly, as if a barely noticeable crack appears in the wall, through which cold seeps. Everything goes numb inside, and you're no longer screaming, crying, or indignant. You're just picking up the pieces because you can't afford to be weak. In those days, I felt like a thudding heart in a body that had to move, speak, and act. I didn't know where to start, where to go, or how to get back what once belonged to me, not by right of power, but by right of love. The only thing I felt clearly was the need to find out the truth to the end. Not guesses, not fragments of conversations, not hints. And the clear, pure truth, which cannot be refuted. The gallery in Atlanta is a place where my grandfather took me as a teenager. I remembered his hand, warm and strong, when we looked at the exhibitions together. Those were his favorite days. A space among light, shadow, and color. He knew many collectors and was one of the people for whom art meant more than fashion or money. I didn't think I'd ever come back here alone. This time, the highway seemed not to be a journey, but an escape from reality, which was built without my participation. I was driving, clutching the will in my bag, as if it were not just paper, but an amulet against lies. Inside the gallery, silence and coolness reigned. The walls were painted white, the ceilings were high, the smell of old catalogs and fresh paint. I went up to the counter, introduced myself, and gave the name of Arthur Matthews. The woman behind the counter smiled, remembering him immediately. She took me to her office and showed me the archives. My grandfather had indeed participated in several exhibitions. He was respected, and his collection was the subject of discussion in a narrow circle. I asked about the painting. The woman frowned, rummaged through the database and, after a few minutes, turned the screen to me. On it is a photograph of a seascape, my landscape. Caption, untitled, late 19th century. Private collection. Sold at auction 3 weeks ago for $350,000. Seller, Nicholas Matthews. For a moment, it seemed to me that I couldn't hear a sound, not her words, not the sound of the air conditioner, not the beating of my heart. Everything froze. Nicholas's name burned my mind like acid, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing with my own eyes. He didn't just sell the painting, he did it openly, officially, with the full knowledge that this thing did not belong to him. He entered himself in the documents as the owner, as if he really believed that he had the right to do so. I asked for a printout, explaining that it was related to the inheritance. The woman didn't ask any questions, but gave me copies with signatures, seals, and dates. Everything was immaculately decorated. I took the documents, thanked her, and went outside, where the hot sun hit my face like a blow. Everything was confirmed. Betrayal, indifference, greed, everything I tried to shield myself from took shape. When I got back to Savannah, I wasn't crying anymore. Inside, something stretched out, became dry, strong, like an old root that broke through concrete. I could feel the disappointment slowly turning into determination. I didn't know if I could get the painting back. But I knew that I would not be silent anymore. At home, I went into the kitchen, where my mother, as always, was cutting fruit, as if nothing had happened. I put the copies of the documents in front of her. She looked at them with mild annoyance, then at me. There was no fear in her eyes, just fatigue, as if she had known in advance that this would happen. She said that everything was done for my benefit. That I couldn't have done it. What Nicholas needs more is a family, children, business, responsibility. That art is not a profession, but a hobby. I wanted to object, but I knew it wasn't an argument. This is protection. A shield of lies, built over the years. Mom said that maybe grandfather was wrong to leave me such a thing. That women have their moods, but real estate and capital are for men. I looked at her and understood, we live in different worlds. And if I'd tried to fit into them before, now I knew I didn't have to. Nicholas refused to talk. He just sent me a short message saying that everything was done by mutual agreement with my parents, and that I should be grateful that they left my grandfather's house to me at all. From his point of view, everything was fair. As if love is a property that can be redistributed. I collected everything I had, copies of the will, printouts from the gallery, screenshots of messages. For me, each proof has become a step up from the pit of betrayal to the light of action. Through friends, I came across an old lawyer, Ted Rivers, who once handled my parents' business back in the 90s, and now worked in a small firm on the outskirts of the city. He listened to me attentively, silently flipping through the papers. Then he sat for a long time, looking out the window, and finally said that the case was difficult, but not hopeless. The painting was indeed bequeathed to me. The sale is illegal. But Nicholas and his parents are likely to defend themselves aggressively. If the case goes to court, they can launch a campaign to discredit. Make me a crazy, emotionally unstable girl who doesn't know what she's doing. They have connections, money, and influence in their hands. I have the truth. But the truth, he says, needs to be careful. I left him late at night. The streets already smelled of lilacs and gasoline. I walked, clutching the documents to my chest, and for the first time in a long time I felt not fear, but strength. They thought I was going to break down. That, as always, I will go into the shadows. That I would swallow the insult, as I had done before. But they forgot one thing: I'm not alone. Behind me is my grandfather's voice, his look, his faith in me. And now I'm not backing down anymore. A trial, contrary to how it is portrayed in films, is not a scene of drama, but a viscous, slow movement through a maze of rules, words, and papers, where the truth often drowns in formalities. The beginning of the lawsuit against Nicholas was not a triumph. It was an act of desperation disguised as bravery. I filed a lawsuit not for revenge, not out of a thirst for justice, but because I couldn't do otherwise. Silence would be consent. And no matter what they called me, I couldn't accept that my truth could be erased from the world like an unnecessary line from a draft. The lawyer, Ted Rivers, told me right away that the case was going to be messy. Nicholas will hire the best, those who know how to build versions, distort facts, and treat the law like plasticine. And he was not mistaken. Already in the first weeks, the local media picked up the news, inflating it into something much more than a personal conflict. The headlines were nauseating: sister versus brother, the fight for the canvas, silent heiress sues successful realtor. Not a single reporter tried to understand the motives. No one was interested in my name, just the last name that I carried, now like a brand. The parents did not hide their irritation. My father talked about how it would damage the family's reputation, how clients would start avoiding his practice, and how students would look at my mother with pity or ridicule. For them, I became a source of public shame, a threat that needed to be isolated. Nicholas played to the audience, confident, open, demonstrating that he holds no grudge, but there was a lie in every word he said, stretched like varnish on cheap furniture. He called me a lost sister, hinted at childish insults and an unstable psyche. My friends, whose silence I initially attributed to confusion, eventually disappeared altogether. There was only emptiness, hollow and sharp, like a bottomless well. I came to every hearing with the same look that my grandfather used to take me to exhibitions, with a straight back, a restrained look, and an inner core that seemed to have been forged in me along with his will. Nicholas's lawyer, smooth and always smiling, played on the edge in the courtroom. He didn't call me unstable directly, but there was a subtext in every question he asked. "Miss Matthews, tell me, when was the last time you were employed permanently? Do you believe that a person without a law degree is able to adequately interpret a will? Do you agree that, being an artist, you are prone to irrational actions?" These questions were like a scalpel, exposing vulnerabilities rather than facts. But Ted knew how to respond, not with anger, not with hysteria, but with facts. He brought to light a will that had been notarized. He brought letters from Arthur, where he wrote about the meaning of the painting. He showed me the photos of me next to my grandfather in his office, with the same canvas, years before his death. All this did not refute the sale, but it painted a context that Nicholas wanted to erase. The turn came suddenly. Among the papers Ted collected was a copy of the document according to which the painting was allegedly given to Nicholas during his grandfather's lifetime. There was a signature on it, precise, neat, but too neat. We sent her for a graphological examination, and she confirmed that the signature was forged. The proof became a nail in his brother's carefully constructed facade. There was silence in the courtroom as the judge announced the expert's report. I looked at Nicholas, and for the first time in months, I saw fear in his eyes, not disdain. He realized that he was no longer in control of the situation. The media is as changeable as the wind. The very next day, other headlines appeared: fraud in the Matthews family, new details of the case revealed, a picture with a shadow of deception, brother forged grandfather's signature. The journalists suddenly remembered that I, too, am a human being, not just a shadow in a conflict, but a figure with a voice. They asked for interviews, comments, offers of participation in a talk show. I refused. I didn't want to be a heroine, I wanted to be heard. And that was enough for me. Mom didn't talk to me. My father stopped greeting me at random meetings. Nicholas filed a counterclaim. He tried to accuse me of defamation, collusion with Ted, even encroachment on family property. But the court was no longer on his side. The ground beneath his feet began to sag. I've been living in my grandfather's house all this time. He has become for me not only a refuge, but also a reminder of why I am fighting. Every morning I went into his office, now empty, but still filled with light. The smell of moss and salt from the river penetrated through the window, and in this silence I felt that my grandfather was somewhere nearby. His faith, his justice, they didn't die with him. And let me be alone. I wasn't afraid anymore. In this solitary struggle, I found myself. Not a daughter, not a sister, not a burden. I was an heiress of memory, an artist, a woman who no longer bows her head. And everything I did now was not against them, but for myself. Justice, as it turned out, was not a triumph. She came not as a shining ray of truth, but as a dim dawn after a long, sleepless night, fragile, painful, almost joyless. The court's decision, announced in a crowded courtroom, sounded dry, almost indifferent. The judge, with a tired expression on his face, ruled that Nicholas' actions were found to be unlawful, the painting must be returned, and compensation for moral damage and violation of inheritance rights is awarded. I was sitting motionless at that moment, as if trying to figure out why my heart wasn't pounding louder, why there was no jubilation inside, but silence, thick and viscous, like honey spilled on the floor of an old house. Nicholas didn't look at me. He stood with a frozen smile, stretched like a strap on a suitcase, ready to burst. When the judge left the courtroom, he turned to his lawyers and walked past me as if I were furniture. The parents were silent. They left without waiting for the end. Later that evening, I received their letter. Not personally, but through a lawyer. I was asked to immediately vacate the family home where I was temporarily staying while the trial was underway. Not a word of sympathy. Not a single line to acknowledge the pain they caused with their tacit consent. I packed my things in one suitcase. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because there was no point in staying anymore. The family that I tried so hard to keep in my heart erased me from my memory like a mistake. I moved into my grandfather's house, into the same cabin with peeling paint on the shutters, creaking steps, and a tiny garden overgrown with thorny bushes. And for the first time in a long time, she exhaled. The air smelled different here, tart, with an admixture of dust and old books that held the breath of another time. The walls were not condemned here. You could be yourself here. The city started talking. I was met with looks, not angry, not sympathetic, but wary. Some averted their eyes. Others, on the contrary, watched for too long. In the grocer's shop, an older woman asked if it was true that I had sued my brother for almost $500,000. They didn't offer me a cup of tea in the library like they used to. At the museum, where I used to work as a volunteer, I was politely told that there were no vacancies now. Sometimes I felt like a criminal who was accidentally given freedom. My name didn't sound like a name, but like an epigraph to a family tragedy spread by newspapers. And Nicholas. He started his own war. He sued the gallery, claiming that he was not properly informed about the market value of the painting. His realtor's license was revoked. Some of his clients have publicly stated that they were unaware of the transactions involving suspicious documents. His photos disappeared from billboards, but appeared in the columns of the tabloid press. We both lost, but in different ways. I am the relationship, he is the reputation. The amount of compensation I was awarded did not seem like a victory. It was not money, but the equivalent of pain, assessed according to the tariff of the law. I withdrew a small amount, just enough to rebuild the house. I painted the walls, patched up the cracks in the floor, sorted through my grandfather's books, and cleaned the old paintings from the dust. There was something cleansing about the process. I was giving the house a voice back. He spoke to me through the silence, not with accusations or reproaches, but with his presence. I found notes in his drawers, lists of artists, names of gallery owners, even an essay about the sea. I kept all this, no matter how pointless it might look from the outside. I invested the rest of the money in my studies. She enrolled in the distance learning department of the Faculty of Art History at the University of Boston. I listened to lectures at night, wrote essays at dawn. Studying at 30 wasn't easy. His confidence wavered like an uneven easel. But I felt like I was going to where I should have always been. Art, like truth, doesn't scream, it breathes softly, and if you pay enough attention, it responds. The last thing I did with this money was to open a charitable foundation. She called him Arthur. No last name, no loud slogans. Just a name. The foundation was supposed to help young artists, especially those who feel unnoticed. I knew what it was like to be in the shadows. And I knew how one person, believing in you, can change everything. In evenings, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink behind the hedge. The house was slowly waking up, coming to life. I hung paintings on the walls, not the ones that cost hundreds of thousands, but the ones that had a heart. Sometimes my neighbors came to me, cautiously at first, then with smiles. Old John brought apples, and Mrs. Harper brought her famous corn tortillas. It was as if even the city, tired of its own gossip, had begun to forget the feud. But it was impossible to forget. Justice has cost me too dearly to enjoy it lightly. She didn't bring her family back. She didn't heal the old wounds. But she freed me from the lies on which our appearance was based. I've lost a lot, but I've found myself. And, perhaps, this is the real price of justice. The morning started with the wind. The same light, almost transparent one that stretched from the coast, running through the freshly mown grass, playing with foliage, leaving a trace of coolness and a lively presence on the skin. I woke up not from an alarm clock, not from an alarm, as it used to happen before, but from a slow rustling, as if the garden outside the window was whispering something through the open shutters. The sun's rays spread across the floor in soft streaks, penetrating through the lace curtains, and I, covered with a blanket, just lay there for a while, allowing myself to listen to the silence. A year has passed. I counted it not by days or seasons, but by the deeds that I managed to complete. The house, which had once been inhabited only by memory, now breathed life. I took care of it as carefully as I would an old book with a cracked spine, washing, sanding, straightening every corner, putting into every nail and every brush stroke the respect I felt for its former owner. Hibiscus bushes were now in bloom in the garden, a climbing rose was wrapped around the old gazebo, and along the path leading to the house, lavender plants were swaying merrily in the air, giving their tart, almost dreamlike fragrance in the morning. This place became a home again, not just a building, but a heart in which one could live, feel, and be. In the living room, in the lightest part of it, under the glass, hung the same painting. A seascape, faded with age, with olive reflections of the water and a gloomy sky, under which fishing boats were moving. She was a pain to me once. A symbol of betrayal, loss, and family separation. I looked at her differently now. Arthur lived in it. Not as an image, but as a meaning. His faith in me, his patience, his silent protection. The painting no longer tugged at the soul. She was an anchor, something that kept me grounded when everything around me was trying to pull me into the storm. Every morning began with a ritual, a cup of strong coffee, a small notebook and a tablet with letters. I was opening my email, checking new requests to the fund. The letters came from everywhere, from New Mexico, Oregon, Michigan. Young artists, students, graduates, just brave children, sent their works, told about themselves, about their fears and dreams. They didn't know me personally, they hadn't heard about my stories. And that was the best thing. I was not surrounded by the shadow of scandal, I was known by the name of the foundation, Arthur, without a surname. Just a name. As a symbol of support, unrelated to blood and drama. I didn't just select projects, I delved into every letter, into every paint on the canvas. It was almost a sacrament to be a part of someone else's formation, as my grandfather had once been a part of mine. Sometimes I dreamed about Arthur at night. Not like before, with memories full of longing. Now he was coming as part of an inner voice. In these dreams, he did not speak loudly. He was standing by the window, smoking a pipe, watching the rain, and I knew he was pleased. And it was enough not to break down at the moments when loneliness was especially close. Because loneliness has not disappeared. It became different, not an emptiness, but a silence in which you could hear yourself. My parents didn't try to contact me. No calls, no emails, no visits. I only knew about their lives from rare mentions in the local newspaper. Nicholas left the state after a series of lawsuits, and his business finally collapsed. His mother retired, and his father rarely appeared in public life. Their absence has ceased to be a wound. It has become a familiar landscape, like a wasteland outside the city that does not cause pain if you do not look at it. I wasn't looking for approval anymore. She didn't need permission to live her life. I built it myself, albeit on ruins, but with an honest foundation. Sometimes I opened old folders with drawings from my childhood, the ones I hid in my desk drawer, afraid to show them. And I was surprised, there was so much truth in them. The sea, the faces, the abstract lines, full of anxiety. I couldn't speak then, so I drew. Now I'm speaking in words, helping others, and it's like going back to the beginning, only now with a power that wasn't there before. That day, as on other days, I finished my coffee, got up, and went out on the porch. The wind was blowing in the garden. The leaves rustled, the sun splintered on the ground in the shade of an oak tree. I looked at this world, simple, warm, in which there was nothing perfect, but everything was real. I didn't know what would happen next. Perhaps new difficulties, new losses. But there was a certainty inside. Now I would not turn away from the path. I was not a hero, I was not a fighter, I was not a martyr. I was just a woman who had walked through the storm and learned to be, not for someone else, but for myself. And in this quiet morning, amidst the scent of a lavender garden and an old tree, there was more freedom than in any resounding victory.